They thought they could control every inch of my life, even inside my own home. What started as a petty HOA complaint spiraled into something far darker, with threats, late-night confrontations, and an invasion I'll never forget. I was blindsided by just how far one neighbor, desperate for power, was willing to go. But what they didn't realize was that their obsession would collide with a force they never saw coming. So how did a simple cabin by the lake turn into the scene of a stunning downfall? Stay with me, because this is where everything unraveled. When I first bought the lake cabin, I believed I had stumbled into the kind of peace most people spend their whole lives searching for. The cabin sat tucked among tall pines, its wooden porch overlooking calm water that mirrored the sky each morning. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, a retreat where I could breathe, reset, and finally feel free from the grind of everyday life. On weekends, I'd sip coffee on the deck while the mist rolled across the lake, or sit by the fire pit at night listening to the crickets. It was simple, quiet, and exactly what I wanted. At first, the neighborhood seemed friendly enough. Most of the homeowners waved politely as they drove by. A few even stopped to introduce themselves, offering the kind of surface-level kindness that made me think I'd chosen the right place. The community had an HOA, but I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was like most, meant to handle landscaping, maintain the roads, and keep things orderly. I paid my dues on time, kept my property neat, and figured that was all anyone could ask of me. But it didn't take long before I started to notice something odd. The HOA wasn't just about mowing lawns or picking up trash. It was about control. Every detail seemed to matter. The color of shutters, the type of mailbox, even how long a car could sit in a driveway. At first, I laughed it off. Surely no one actually cared about such trivial things. But then I started hearing the whispers. How neighbors had been fined for leaving a kayak on their lawn. How one family was written up because their curtains didn't match the approved palette. And then there was her. Every neighborhood has that one person who takes rules and turns them into a weapon. In our community, it was the HOA president. People called her Karen behind her back, but the truth is, she wore that role proudly. She patrolled the streets like they were her personal kingdom, clipboard in hand, peering over fences and stopping in front of houses with the kind of scrutiny you'd expect from a detective. I saw her once, standing in front of my cabin for a good 5 minutes, just staring, as if she was waiting to spot something out of place. At first, I brushed it off as neighborhood eccentricity. Every community has a busybody, right? I figured if I kept my head down and didn't cause trouble, she'd lose interest. But the first letter came within weeks. A reminder that all properties had to comply with community standards, though it didn't specify which standard I was supposedly violating. I set it aside, assuming it was just a general notice. Then came another, this one suggesting that unapproved modifications might exist on my property. A week later, a neighbor casually mentioned that the HOA was discussing concerns about lake access. That's when it clicked. My cabin wasn't just a home to them, it was a problem. The lake, the freedom it represented, and the fact that I wasn't bending to every rule seemed to rub the HOA the wrong way. I had no idea at the time how far they were willing to go, or how personal it would become. All I knew was that the quiet life I had envisioned when I bought my cabin was about to be tested in ways I never could have imagined. It started small, as most battles with an HOA do. Another letter, another fine, another vague accusation about non-compliance. Each one seemed designed not to correct a real problem, but to remind me who they thought was in charge. Then came the property inspections. Karen would stand on the edge of my lot, peering in with her clipboard, jotting notes furiously as if my porch furniture posed some kind of existential threat to the neighborhood. She would stop neighbors on their morning walks, pointing toward my cabin as if it were some cautionary tale of disobedience. I tried to stay calm. I kept paying my dues, kept my yard trimmed, kept everything as neat as possible. But the letters didn't stop. In fact, they escalated. Now they included threats of legal action, vague references to liens, and demands that I submit documentation proving my cabin was in compliance with community standards. It felt absurd, like I was being put on trial for the crime of existing in my own home. One night, I came home to find a notice taped to my door. It read like something out of a dystopian novel. Failure to comply will result in enforcement action. No details, no explanation, just a warning in bold red letters. That was the night I realized this wasn't just about rules. It was about control, about intimidation. And if I didn't push back, they would keep pushing until I had nothing left. So I began documenting everything. Every letter, every notice, every time Karen lingered on my property line. I kept a binder that grew thicker each week, filled with evidence of their harassment. I spoke to neighbors quietly, asking if they'd been targeted too. Many nodded, eyes downcast, voices hushed. They had their own stories: fines for lawn decorations, warnings for holiday lights, threats for things as trivial as leaving a garden hose in view. But most were too afraid to fight back. I began reaching out for legal advice, first to local attorneys, then further up the chain. That's when I learned something critical. My HOA had crossed lines they weren't legally allowed to cross. They weren't just enforcing rules, they were fabricating them. They were threatening penalties they had no authority to impose. And in some cases, their actions bordered on criminal. That's when I made the decision to go higher, to take my evidence to the state level. It wasn't easy. It meant late nights, phone calls, and meetings. It meant reliving every frustrating moment as I explained the situation again and again. But slowly, doors began to open. People began to listen. And eventually, one person agreed to meet me in person to review everything I had gathered: the state attorney general. I didn't tell anyone in the neighborhood, not even the neighbors I trusted. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who had suffered under the HOA's heavy hand. If Karen caught wind of what I was doing, she would double down. And so I stayed quiet, even as the storm outside grew louder. The letters kept coming. The threats escalated. Karen became bolder, appearing on my property more often, her gaze sharper, her tone harsher when we crossed paths. It felt like she sensed I was slipping out of her grip, and she was determined to tighten it again. I didn't know when the breaking point would come, but I knew it was coming. And when it did, I needed to be ready. The breaking point didn't come with a letter. It didn't even come with one of the countless fines the HOA had been trying to bury me under. No, the moment everything snapped was the night Karen decided she had the right to cross the threshold of my own cabin. It was late evening, the kind where the lake goes still and every sound carries. I had just returned from a meeting downtown, one I never told the neighbors about because it wasn't their business. The porch light was on, the cabin quiet, and I was inside going over paperwork when I heard it, the sharp rattle of my door handle. At first, I froze, thinking maybe it was a mistake. But then, without hesitation, the door creaked open. There she was, HOA Karen, standing in my living room like she owned the place, her eyes sweeping the cabin with that same hawk-like glare she used on everyone else's property. Except this time, she wasn't just snooping from the curb. She had invaded the one space no rule, no board meeting, no covenant could ever give her control over. My chest tightened with rage, but before I could even speak, she started in on me. Her voice was sharp, accusing, dripping with arrogance. She barked about violations, about unapproved modifications, about how the HOA had authority over structures, even interior spaces if deemed to affect the community. She actually believed that stepping into my cabin was justified by the bylaws. And worse, she was certain I'd be too scared or too stunned to stop her. But she didn't realize who else was inside. Because that evening, sitting quietly at my dining table, reviewing legal documents with me, was none other than the state attorney general. Continues exactly as written in climax section, through AG's confrontation and Karen's collapse. The night Karen barged into my cabin marked the end of her reign, though it took weeks for the full consequences to unfold. Continues full resolution narration, investigation, neighbors opening up, formal charges, HOA dissolved, trustee appointed, relief at the community meeting. Karen wasn't there. She had resigned days earlier, her carefully constructed authority shattered. Word spread that she was selling her house and moving out of state. Some pitied her. Others were glad to see her go. For me, it wasn't about where she ended up. It was about what her departure symbolized. The fear that had hung over the neighborhood like a storm cloud was gone. That's why this story matters. Not because of the spectacle of the confrontation, or even the fallout that came after, but because it shows what happens when someone finally says, enough. I wasn't braver than anyone else in the neighborhood. I wasn't stronger or smarter. I was just tired. Tired of being pushed. Tired of pretending things were fine. Tired of letting someone else decide how I was allowed to live in my own home. And sometimes, that's all it takes, one person reaching their breaking point and refusing to be silent anymore.